And I was just about to do as brief but good a summary of the conversations yesterday. So Tom began by talking about community and connection in community, and pointed out in a society that is so often focused on individualism that one of the things jazz teaches us is that there is no such thing as a solo without context. In other words, we're always playing in a relationship. And it's always a context of resonance, where a single note finds its resonance within its broader context. So whether that's physical or relational or missional, being increasingly aware of the intricacies and the breadth and the depth of that context is one of the things that jazz invites us into. And that became apparent in the conversations yesterday in an amazing way. Dan and Tom were talking music that all of you will understand far more fully than I said to Jill this morning, I think I understood about half of it. I said, but understanding that half made me really want to find out, to keep digging into the other stuff. So one of Tom's thought mentors is a guy by the name of Alfred North Whitehead, process philosophy and process theology. But he said at one point, beauty is a harmony of contrasts. Beauty is a harmony of contrasts. And so that wonderful paradoxical idea of harmony and contrasts and how do you play around with that? So you bring variance together in a joyful coherence. It's rich, it's deep, it's meaningful. But to get there, you have to go through tension, dissonance, and call and response. And be able to sit with those and live with those in the midst of those. So one of the images that he talked about was when you put a cord under tension, the immediate response is you want to cut the tension because you're not comfortable with the tension. And so you cut the cord. But that destroys all the potential in the tension. And in our human communities, if we get, especially in churches, if you get a little bit of tension, it's, oh my God, we got to fix it. And usually by our impulse to fix it is to cut it. Either cut somebody off, cut somebody out, send them away, because they're pathologically destructive to our community. And there's a huge discomfort with dissonance. And so part of the conversation these guys were having by email last night, I don't know, 4 o'clock in the morning, something like that, was that whole idea of what happens as you sit with the dissonance and move more into the dissonance, and are there resolutions? So the call and response piece, is there a response beyond what we can currently imagine that takes us to a different level of coherence, of consonance? And are we comfortable sitting with the lack of resolution until the Spirit helps us understand something more broadly and more deeply? This is all my language, and Tom can. But within this community, and especially when you look at what goes on in the community of jazz, perceptions change in the midst of that tension and dissonance. Perceptions change that broaden our understanding of things. And it's in that tension and dissonance that the creative productivity emerges. And if you don't sit with it, that's not going to happen. And then we got into talking about Bill Evans and the idea of the universal musical brain. And how does music narrate a universal story. We talked about when we're improvising together, letting silence, first of all, being attentive, so listening, letting silence work its wonders, being responsive, being empathetic, and being open. So all of these ideas work. And then, Naomi, to go back to something you mentioned, and in a community that is honoring these things and paying attention to them, there's got to be vulnerability, right? You've got to be comfortable making mistakes. You've got to be comfortable being honest about where you are in your understanding of this stuff, and feel that space is safe to do that. And I think all of us were aware that often doesn't happen in the church. But that vulnerability then opens the capacity for being surprised and really receiving what the other has to offer. And not trying to manipulate what the other has to offer. And one of Tom's themes in his theological writing and his theological work is hospitality. And so how all of this really, in many ways, gets summed up in that idea of God's hospitality. God both as host and guest. Right? So again, that paradoxical picture of what God's all about. It was just a side, well, we talked a little about it, but the group that Ron talked about, so we call them the sanctuary sessions. And there's 5 or 6 musicians that come together once every couple of weeks for, 5 sessions.
On a good
whenever we can herd them. It's kind of like herding flies. And Ron, bless his heart, has the job of doing that. So
I had all the phone numbers.
And remember, he said he was an accountant, right? So you can imagine how somebody with that order to mind gets frustrated with jazz musicians trying to get together and jam. And then Dan and Conrad Good, one of Dan's, Fred, they've been playing since they were 13. So they're the musical mentors. And then I come along and listen in, and every now and then throw in some ideas about what I often say is, with jazz musicians, is you play whatever you want, I'm going to read theology into it. And so that's part of the dynamic. But the best insight I've had, this is the 3rd one we've done, I think. They were playing Jobim's Triste, which is a song about unrequited love. And it was Mark Bender, the bass player, who said when we were chatting about it, he said, I never thought about this before. He said, I wonder if God's an unrequited lover. And there's just this dead silence, and all of a sudden you say, yeah. No, and I mean, I keep coming back to that idea over and over again. I mean, I thought that was brilliant. But that's a good example of the kind of you sit in these conversations and you engage in them, and all of a sudden the Spirit does this kind of bingo. And it's great. Anyhow, so that's the sort of stuff that...
And interesting enough, Dan and Conrad and you were really focused on the vulnerability and allowing people there's no wrong notes, there's no mistakes, and taking that of, what Darlene and I'm more used to, and probably you too, in the evangelical, play it like this and all this kind of stuff. But even in the context of what our jazz experience was, it was much more crafted and, pop versus more as an individual, we're bringing something to the table. I mean, our guitar player had quite a revelation and kind of opened up in his playing, and he's got the skills, but he was just always nervous of being judged or not doing the right thing.
Not doing it right.
Yeah. So, it's interesting just hearing these reflections, because that context was being developed, the space to be creative and to build community, and it's very
And safe space. I mean, we talked a lot about that yesterday, is how that space for vulnerability needs to be safe. And so there's that trust level, that respect level, that mutuality level that was it you that was telling the story about, maybe it was, anyhow, so somebody had done either with Bill Evans or anyhow, so somebody had made a real, it was Miles Davis, Herbie Hancock, yeah. Yeah, so tell the story, if you don't mind.
Sure, it's just an example
Please.
of there's no mistake, there's no wrong notes, because the community context creates a way to hold that. And Herbie tells a story about a night with Miles and the band's cooking, and everything's great, and he hits a corner. And he goes, great, I just ruined it. And Miles played a note that made everything sonorous and gorgeous, and it invited the music into an entirely new level. And so it's just the sense that Miles was attentive, responsive, turned a mistake into a possibility for a greater groove. And I love that story.
It's a great story.
It's a life story about, hey, a good community holds each other and opens mistakes into possibilities. And a teacher, I didn't share this yesterday at mine, once said, yeah, there are no mistakes even in classical music. There's just wrong resolutions. So,
I hadn't heard that end of the story,
just
yeah.
wrong resolutions, and I thought, well, yeah, and the community creates the resolution together.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
the context of a mutual
Yeah.
vulnerability. Anyways, I love the Herbie story.
No,
That's
it's a great
Yeah, and
story.
Herbie did that album called Possibilities, wasn't it, Herbie? Where he
Yeah.
brought in pop artists,
Yep.
Mhm.
and one was John Mayer, who had a couple tidbits of a thought, and a friend had said, oh yeah, Mayer's got a couple ideas, and they kind of developed a whole song. Stitch Me Up came out of that session. But that was really, it's interesting. I'm not sure that was part of why he did that, but it's interesting that he named that title and that album with more or less pop musicians, right? They can hold their own, but yeah.
So, and then just to quickly wrap up, when Tom was talking about spirituality, and he set it up so that as spirituality kind of the other side of communities, so that you've got community, and then you've got Tom's writings focus on kind of individual spirituality, spiritual disciplines and jazz and those kinds of things, but always within that context of community, so it's both and. But he talked about three qualities. There's the impulse to belong and the feeling of being at home. Being tuned to that. Jazz is a connection-making exercise with deep emotional creativity, so that you get that feel for being an agent of creativity in the cosmos and for the cosmos. Then the dynamic searching quality of jazz. You're playing, but you're always searching and listening for the possibility. And there's a kind of rest, a positive restlessness there. And so I remember thinking when you mentioned that, how within the Christian tradition so often we go back to Augustine's, the soul is restless until it finds its rest in God, and so restlessness has a negative connotation. That it's the sort of drivenness that happens when we aren't in touch with our source of being. And this was a whole different understanding of the creativity of restlessness and the positive searching vitality of restlessness. And then, as we've talked about, the openness to being unsettled, the openness to being challenged, to having your worldview ripped apart, because it's too narrow. And so open to transformation, surprised by the unexpected, and relating that to hospitality, especially hospitality for the stranger, who's going to bring a whole new set of dimensions into your life. So whether that stranger is somebody playing weird jazz in a place that's used to worship music or classical music, whether it's somebody of a different nationality, a different ethnicity, different language, whatever. Tom's son has Asperger's, and so differently abled, so a person with a disability, and the disruption and unsettling that causes in those relationships, and how you deal with that. And so jazz creates a space where you can be open to that, where there's the hope of resolution, but it may not be the resolution that you think it should be.